To understand the weight of this revenge, you have to understand the bond that existed before the blood was spilled. In the 1830s and 40s, the U.S. Army was a small, elite circle. Montgomery C. Meigs and Robert E. Lee weren't just colleagues, they were the golden boys of the Engineer Corps. Meigs looked up to Lee. When Lee made the agonizing decision to turn his back on the Union in 1861, Meigs didn't see a man following his conscience. He saw a traitor who had broken a sacred vow to the flag. Meigs, who became the quartermaster general, the man in charge of all Union supplies, fueled his exhaustion and stress into a cold, hard hatred for Lee. He blamed Lee personally for every Union life lost. The setting of this revenge is Arlington House. Built by George Washington Parke Custis, the step-grandson of George Washington, it sat on a high ridge overlooking the Potomac River. From the front porch of Arlington House, you could look directly down into the city of Washington, see the unfinished Capitol Dome, and watch the White House. It was the most strategic and most symbolic piece of land in the region. When the war started, the Lee family fled, and Union troops immediately occupied the house to use it as a lookout point. Meigs spent years watching Lee's former home from his office in D.C. To him, the house sat there like a monument to Lee's betrayal. He didn't just want the Union to win, he wanted to strip Lee of his legacy. By 1864, the Civil War had turned into a meat grinder. The Overland Campaign was producing casualties at a rate the world had never seen. The existing cemeteries in Washington, D.C. and Alexandria were literally full. Bodies were being stacked in hallways. At the same time, the federal government was looking for ways to punish rebels. They passed the Acts of 1862 and 1863, which levied a direct tax on properties in Confederate-held areas. The petty detail. The law was written with a specific, cruel requirement. The owner had to pay the tax in person. Mary Lee, Robert E. Lee's wife, was the legal owner of Arlington. She was elderly and crippled by rheumatoid arthritis. She sent a cousin with the money, but the tax commissioners, likely under pressure from the War Department, flatly refused the payment. They declared the property delinquent. The government bought the land at auction for $26,800. Now the U.S. government owned Lee's home, and Meigs had his opening. In May 1864, Meigs accompanied a group of officers to Arlington. He walked the grounds with a grim purpose. He didn't want the soldiers buried in the woods or down by the river where they wouldn't be noticed. He walked right up to Mrs. Lee's rose garden, located just paces from the mansion's windows. He pointed to the dirt and ordered the first graves to be dug right there. On May 13, 1864, a private named William Christman became the first to be buried. But that wasn't enough for Meigs. He wanted to make sure that even if a peace treaty was signed, the Lees could never return to a home that felt like a home. Meigs's revenge became architectural. He ordered the construction of a massive vault at the edge of the garden. Inside, he placed the remains of 2,111 unknown soldiers gathered from the battlefields of Bull Run. Why? Because he knew that no Southern gentleman, and certainly not Robert E. Lee, would ever dare to dig up the bodies of thousands of soldiers just to reclaim a garden. The bodies acted as a moral shield. By surrounding the house with the dead, Meigs transformed the mansion from a residence into a mausoleum. After the war ended in 1865, Robert E. Lee never actually returned to the house. He knew what Meigs had done. He spent the rest of his life as a college president in Virginia, effectively homeless from his ancestral estate. The story, however, has a final twist of justice. After Lee died, his son, George Washington Custis Lee, sued the U.S. government. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1882, United States versus Lee. The verdict: the court ruled 5-4 that the in-person tax requirement was unconstitutional and that the government had essentially stolen the land.
The reality, by 1882, there were over 20,000 graves on the property. Custis Lee realized that even though he won, he couldn't exactly kick out 20,000 dead soldiers. In a final act of weary resignation, he sold the property back to the government for $150,000, about $4.5 million today. The legacy. Today, Arlington National Cemetery is the most sacred ground in America. It is the site of the tomb of the unknown soldier and the eternal flame for JFK. But beneath the honor and the ceremony lies the origin story, a tale of a man who was so offended by his friend's betrayal that he turned his friend's front yard into a graveyard just to make sure he could never go home again.